Hello, welcome to Washington-Talk. I'm Young-Gyo Kim. South and North Korea reopened communication hotlines that the North severed more than a year ago. It is raising the prospect that the North Korean regime could be ready to engage, as both Seoul and Pyongyang said the move is a step toward restoring the trust between the two Koreas. Today we'll discuss what has led to the revived inter-Korean communications and what this could mean for the possible denuclearization talks with the U.S. Joining me is Daniel Sneider. Mr. Sneider is a lecturer in international policy at Stanford's Ford Dorsey Masters in International Policy and a lecturer in East Asian Studies at Stanford University. His own research is focused on current U.S. foreign and national security policy in Asia and on the foreign policy of Korea and Japan. Eric Brewer also joins me today. Mr. Brewer is Senior Fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He served as the Director for Counterproliferation at the National Security Council. He played a lead role in coordinating the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign on North Korea. Welcome to the program.
Thanks.
Pleasure to be with you.
The reopening of the communication channels between the two Koreas came 13 months after North Korea cut off all communication lines with the South. It does seem to be a positive sign. How did you take the news?
Well, I think it's always good to have direct communications between South Korea and North Korea, but I think it's too early to predict exactly how this is going to play out, where this is going to go. And so I'd be very cautious in making any assessments or any guesses that this is going to lead to any real meaningful diplomatic breakthroughs, particularly when it comes to denuclearization and curbing North Korea's nuclear program. Communications have long been a tool that North Korea has used in broader North-South relations. Sort of an incentive, something to dangle, and then something that it can cut off to punish, to try and gain concessions. And so I suspect that's probably North Korea's motives here, in particular because of the dire economic conditions that it's facing within its country. So I think that's probably its main strategy, although it may have other motivations as well.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Sneider, what is North Korea's intention here? Do they need South Korea's help because of their economic situation?
Well, first of all, I'd agree with Eric that while this is positive, it doesn't necessarily indicate where things are really going to go. And after all this really involved was picking up the telephone. It wasn't a substantial commitment in any way from the North Korean side. I think it was interesting that immediately after doing this, Kim Jong-un made some fairly tough statements about the upcoming planned joint military exercises between the United States and South Korea, opposing them. So that gives you some sense that one of their goals, their persistent goals, is always to separate the South Korean government from the United States. That sort of wedge-driving activity is a pretty persistent part of North Korean approaches to the South. But I do think it's important that after taking pretty much cutting off relations now for quite a while and rebuffing repeated efforts on the part of the Moon Jae-in government to open up to improve ties, including offers of humanitarian aid and so forth, that they now made this small opening. And I suspect it does indicate to some degree the really dire internal situation in North Korea. I am a believer in that the internal dynamics really drive most of what the North Koreans do.
Right. Then, Mr. Sneider, do you think this was North Korea regime's own initiative, or was this responding to South Korea's request?
I mean, the South Korean requests have been persistent over, months and months. So I don't see it as a response to South Korea per se. I think it's driven by, as I said, by their own internal conditions more than anything else, and also maybe by their perception of the way in which the South Korean political situation is starting to move. Because while they like to beat up on the progressives even when they're in power, they prefer a progressive government in Seoul to a conservative government. They've seen they have a pretty good reading on what's going on in South Korea. They've seen the events of the last few months, politically, I mean, the possibility that the elections next March may yield a change in administration, return to power of the conservatives. So I think that may be also part of their calculation here.
Mr. Brewer, the leaders of South and North Korea apparently have been exchanging letters since April, which means the letter exchange started before the first Biden-Moon summit in May. What do you make of this situation?
Well, I mean, I don't think there's necessarily a connection between, or really an implication of those letters, the exchanging of the letters occurring before the summit. That's may just be coincidental. I do agree with Dan that I think a lot of the drivers for the timing of North Korea's outreach is the sort of the economic conditions combined with the South Korean political calendar. And so it is not surprising at all to see North Korea doing this now. It knows it's sort of pushing on an open door with the Moon administration when it comes to seeking improved relations. Moon, I think, sees earlier efforts that he's undertaken in this regard and the summits as a really important part of his legacy. It's something that he wants to sort of reaffirm and make permanent to the degree possible with his remaining time in office. And this is something that Kim knows, right? And this is a something that Kim can use to his advantage to exploit that goal of the Moon administration and try and further North Korea's objectives, including potentially securing some type of assistance or food aid. As Dan mentioned earlier, dividing the United States from South Korea to the degree their goals may differ slightly in the emphasis on peace building vice denuclearization. And so I think those are really some of the underlying motives of why this is happening now and why those letters were exchanged, less about the particular timing with the Biden-Moon summit.
The press secretary for the South Korean president said South and North Korea are standing at the starting line again for the ultimate goal of denuclearization. Mr. Brewer, do you think this is what the North Korean regime also had in mind when they reopened the communication channels?
I don't. I don't want to say that improved North-South communication is not valuable at all or can't be useful for nuclear diplomacy, but I think we're a real long ways from that being the case. I don't think Kim has any intention of giving up his nuclear weapons anytime for the foreseeable future. I think denuclearization is going to have to be a distant goal if it's ever achievable. I think far more useful for the United States would be, rather than focusing on the big goal of denuclearization, focusing on some smaller interim steps that can probably cap and, where possible, reverse some of North Korea's progress on its nuclear program. I think here, probably the most valuable places where we could focus are trying to prevent North Korea from perfecting a reliable intercontinental ballistic missile capability that can reach the United States.
Mr. Sneider, do you agree with what Mr. Brewer said? Does North Korea see this as the first step toward the denuclearization?
Denuclearization has never been the goal of the North Koreans. And I think one of the things we learned from all the past years of negotiations with the North Koreans, including during the previous administration, when, after all, they did things that no U.S. administration has done before, including face-to-face meetings with Kim Jong-un, that despite all of that, even the definition of what denuclearization is could not be agreed upon. And that's because I don't think the North Koreans have any intention of denuclearizing. They want to maximize the concessions they get for what little they give in return. And basically, it's been a kind of cap and freeze type of negotiation. And we've had that multiple times. That is what Eric was talking about, that they agree to kind of cap and freeze some of the aspects of their program in exchange for other things that they want. But I'm not even sure we can do that anymore, frankly. But because we've been down this road so many times, and I think everybody on the American side, I feel, is fairly wary of repeating this process again. And although I know the South Korean government desperately wants to resume these negotiations, and certainly they will try and use whatever openings there are from the North to try and persuade the Biden administration to open up the door even more. And we may see some sort of talk about diplomacy. I just don't anticipate there being much actual reality to it.
So, Mr. Sneider, you said that North Korea never really had the intention to denuclearize. Then what should be the next step at this stage?
I'm perfectly happy with strategic patience, if you will, 2.0. I don't know that we need to do anything. There are some, I'm from an American point of view, there are concerns obviously down the road, but basically, the cow was out the barn door long ago. North Koreans can increase their nuclear arsenal and their capabilities to some degree, but we're already in a de facto situation of deterrence and to some degree containment. The biggest problem for the administration is alliance management. I'm not worried about North Korea, I'm worried about South Korea. We need to manage our relationship with our very, very important ally, and therefore we have to accommodate to some degree their needs and desires to open up and seek engagement with North Korea. And we're trying to draw South Korea into a broader framework in the region vis-a-vis China, and also improvement of relations with Japan. So I think those are the primary goals of the administration. And in some sense, North Korea is a secondary issue, a secondary priority, but one that has to be dealt with, again, to manage to the best we can our alliance relationship with South Korea.
Mr. Brewer, what's your thought on this? What should be the next move surrounding North Korea?
Next steps on diplomacy, I would say sort of the first step is that North Korea needs to answer the phone, right? There needs to be, in order to have that type of engagement with the United States, the North needs to be willing to do that. And so I think the first step would probably ideally be a U.S.-North Korea working level meeting, right? We're not going to jump to the presidential level summitry, and we can debate whether that was wise or not wise. But the Biden administration is clearly not interested in doing that right now, right? It needs to have a reason to do that before it moves to that step. So I think you're going to need to, start with working level talks like you've done in the past. I think North Korea is clearly reluctant to engage the United States. It doesn't see the administration's policy as that different from its predecessors. And, there's some truth in that. Dan talked about strategic patience 2.0. But my sense is that the Biden administration is probably more open to the idea of trying to find some sort of smaller interim deal than perhaps certainly the Trump administration was, and perhaps even the Obama administration. So I think there might be some room there. Of course, we were talking about the potential for another Moon Kim summit. There's you can try and use that to some degree to further the nuclear diplomacy goals. Moon could serve as sort of an intermediary to help convey the U.S. position and help urge Kim to attend talks. There is a risk there that in doing so, Moon oversells the optimism of the potential for talks or what North Korea might be able to gain, because he wants to obviously improve relations, which could set the stage for difficulties or failure later on. So you'd have to coordinate that very, very closely. But that is one way in which this I don't want to call it a new relationship or new opening, but these new communication channels could potentially be leveraged for that purpose.
The South Korean president's press secretary also expressed hope for another round of summit talks between South Korean President Moon Jae-in and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. With only 8 months left in President Moon's term, what is South Korean government and what is North Korea trying to achieve here?
Well, President Moon was the chief of staff to President Roh Moo-hyun, and I remember at the end of his term in office, he was rather desperate to have a summit meeting with Kim Jong-il at the time, and it was a bad idea, I think, at the time. I think I wrote something along those lines, particularly because the North Koreans had agreed at the previous summit with Kim Dae-jung that the next summit would be held in Seoul. The only summit I think that's worth having is one where Kim Jong-un comes to South Korea. That's a big step the North Koreans have not been willing to make, because it's an acceptance of, it's a demonstration of the legitimacy of the South Korean government and the South Korean state. And that's something that until they cross that line, as far as I'm concerned, we haven't really made a breakthrough in North-South relations. I wish that Moon Jae-in was seeking that goal, but I don't think he is. I think he's somewhat in the same position he was back in 2005 of feeling frustrated by the process of the last few years. I think they really hope for a breakthrough. I think the tendency in some progressive circles in South Korea is always to blame the United States for the failure to make progress. So there's this kind of mythological, I think mythological narrative about what happened in Hanoi, that the Hanoi talks broke down because of the extreme demands of the United States and John Bolton or whoever they hold responsible for that, demanding all or nothing, which I don't think is actually what happened. They have a hard time, some progressives in South Korea have a hard time accepting the reality that, no, these talks broke down because the North Koreans could not take the steps that were necessary to actually move down the path towards denuclearization. And therefore, I worry that any summit that's based on that kind of, I think, false narrative is going to fail. And could lead us in a bad direction. Bad direction for me means a real division between Seoul and Washington. For me, the goal is always, this is a precious alliance. It's an essential alliance for both countries, and so alliance management is the key here. Again, I don't want to repeat myself, but I feel like you have to keep focus on that. And we'll see what happens. I'm not sure the North Koreans want to have another summit, to tell you the truth, because they're not going to get out of it what they want. That Moon Jae-in wants it, I think that's perfectly clear. And that's more about domestic politics, perhaps, but also a little bit about keeping alive the idea that North-South engagement can actually drive the process beyond where the United States wants it to go.
Mm-hmm. Then, Mr. Sneider, how do you see the possibility that this could lead to the resumption of talks between the U.S. and North Korea?
Well, I think that the Biden administration, from my understanding, probably Eric has a better view of this than I do, they have their sort of lessons of the previous administration's experience is don't go to no dangling of a big summit, of a heads of state summit. You have to go through working level talks. Ambassador Sung Kim has been appointed to do that, and he's a veteran of these talks. He ran the process leading up to the Singapore summit, but he knows very well, as do others, that the North Koreans never engage in working level talks. They only use them to get to the place they wanted to get to, which in that case was a summit with President Trump. So, yeah, we can have working level talks. I don't think the North Koreans ever give anything in working level talks that's meaningful, but that's the only place we can go now. We have to test out, and maybe the North Koreans also want to test what the Biden administration is willing to put on the table. So you can only do that in that setting, and I could see that happen. I could.
Mr. Brewer, U.S. Special Representative Sung Kim has reportedly talked with his counterparts in South Korea and in Japan over this restoration of the inter-Korean communication lines. Do you think this is in line with what the U.S. government has been stressing in terms of the cooperation among these three countries when dealing with North Korea?
I think those types of consultations are fairly routine and very within the lines of what's normal for this type of an issue and with those allies. So it makes a lot of sense that those consultations would take place and that this is something that all three would discuss. Anytime the United States is talking with an adversary, be it for nuclear negotiations or something else, for arms control, it obviously wants to maintain a united front with its allies and partners as part of those conversations. And so and sort of walk in lockstep with them. And I think probably part of this consultation is part of that process, as the United States both works to strengthen alliances, works to strengthen relationships between Japan and South Korea, and then obviously manage the North Korea problem set. And so I think that's probably part of this process, right? And in this case too, this is even more important because, again, when you have allies that maybe agree on the big picture, right, the sort of the long-term goal of denuclearization and managing and eliminating the North Korean nuclear threat, but slight variances, in how they might prioritize sub-objectives within there, be it peace building. For Japan, obviously, the abductee issue is very important. It's something they're always quite keen to make sure is included as a focus of diplomacy and always sort of remain on the table as an issue. And of course, they're also more worried about North Korea's short-range ballistic missiles and other capabilities than the United States is. So I think it's kind of part of that normal consultation process to make sure that all allies' views are being taken into account when these types of dialogues are underway, in this case, between the North and the South. And in particularly in this case, I imagine the U.S. is fairly sensitive to the fact that Moon probably wants to move this at perhaps a faster pace than the United States would like this to go, or if not a faster pace, at least ensuring that this is again synchronized closely with the broader goals of denuclearization and reducing the North Korean nuclear threat. And so there's probably some motive here to make sure that that's managed appropriately as well.
North Korea is being keenly watched as to why it has decided to restart communicating with South Korea. Was this forced by its dire economic situation, or is North Korea really making the first move toward the denuclearization talks? We'll have to wait and find out. Mr. Brewer and Mr. Sneider, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having us.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.